Hello. On behalf of the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library, welcome to our presentation of the naval career of James Downing. I'm Richard Truly. During Jim's career, he was a seaman, a gunner's mate, and an officer. He was also a Naval Postal Clerk aboard the USS West Virginia during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Our story begins in Tokyo Bay, September 2nd, 1945, VJ Day. The Japanese surrender ceremony took place aboard the USS Missouri. 7 other U.S. battleships were present: the USS Colorado, Idaho, Iowa, Mississippi, New Mexico, and South Dakota. Also there was the West Virginia. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, the West Virginia was torpedoed and sunk, but later salvaged by the Navy, reconfigured, and returned to combat. The USS West Virginia can be seen from the deck of the Missouri while General Douglas MacArthur signs the Japanese surrender document. Postal covers commemorating the surrender can be found from the many ships present. The West Virginia was commissioned on December 1st, 1923, and later joined the Pacific Fleet. With a shipboard complement of nearly 1,500 men, postal service was needed on board. A young sailor, fresh out of the Great Lakes Naval Training Station, Jim Downing joined the West Virginia crew in 1933 with the rank of seaman. He learned the ropes of naval duty and was paid $21 a month. Jim was assigned to the number 2 turret housing 2 16-inch guns, which could hurl shells weighing 1 ton up to 18 miles downrange. Dozens of sailors were assigned to each 16-inch turret. As a novice gunner's mate, Jim began learning all the jobs starting at the bottom. He also began appreciating the effects the firing had on the battleship and the dangers the firing posed to the crew and the ship. In the years leading up to World War II, Jim advanced through the ranks from seaman to chief gunner's mate. Throughout his career as a gunner's mate, intensive study and drills were required at all times, involving firing mechanisms, range finding and calculation, battery maintenance, and safety. As a youngster in Missouri, Jim had handled some postal duties at his dad's store back in the late 1920s. This led to another opportunity with his appointment as the Assistant Naval Postal Clerk for West Virginia. Mail the world over has been recognized as an important morale booster for all sailors whose only communication home on long cruises was mail. Many examples of mail to and from sailors aboard the pre-war West Virginia can be found. During his years as a Naval Postal Clerk, some of Jim's duties were sorting mail for delivery to the various divisions on the ship, the sale of stamps, applying shipboard cancellations for outgoing mail and special requests, managing postal finances, including the loss of stamps, collection of fees for telegraphic services, tallying sales, and forwarding of income to supply officers, and processing money orders every 2 weeks for the entire ship's company. Beginning in 1937, an unusual duty involved flying from SOC-3 catapult seaplanes. Battleships were equipped with catapults located on the fantail. The primary mission of these scouting seaplanes was forward reconnaissance and dive bombing. Other duties could include mail pickup and delivery. Jim volunteered as an assistant pilot, thereby earning extra pay and speeding up the delivery of mail. On a peaceful Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, a day that would become known as the Day of Infamy, the battleships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet were moored at Ford Island in Pearl Harbor. Jim was at home, just sitting down to breakfast with his wife, Marina. Meanwhile, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service peered out of his cockpit approaching Hawaii. Fuchida observed the radiant beams of the morning sun, a good omen, reminding him of the Japanese national flag. At 7:50 a.m., Fuchida broadcast, "Tora, Tora, Tora." U.S. forces were attacked at 7:57 in two waves that lasted until 9:30. The brunt of the attack was absorbed by the battleships Arizona, West Virginia, and Oklahoma. All three were sunk or capsized from numerous torpedo and bomb hits. By day's end, Fuchida was full of the glory of a proud victor. Postal history of the attack can be found, but fakes exist. Fakes can be identified by the timestamp of the cancellations which coincide with the inferno. Fakes can also be identified by the presence of censor cancels that were not introduced until later. After the initial attack on Sunday morning, Jim was able to make his way from his home to the West Virginia by about 8:25 a.m. after crossing the blazing harbor. The West Virginia had been repeatedly torpedoed, and its deck was now awash at sea level. Once ashore on Ford Island, Jim needed to crawl over the burning Tennessee to reach his ship. Jim then engaged in fighting fires and assessing damage on his ship. He discovered that the 16-inch guns were inoperable and his shipboard post office had been destroyed. Downing tried to commit to memory the names on the dog tags of those killed and later visited the wounded at the Naval Hospital. He recorded in a notebook the names of the dead and wounded. He also recorded messages that the injured wished to send. As the postmaster, Downing later sent these messages explaining what had happened and the sailor's current condition. A total of 106 officers and men died aboard the West Virginia that day. On December 8th, the fires had been extinguished, and Jim went home to his wife, Marina. After a brief rest, he reassumed his duties by establishing a temporary post office on shore. On December 10th, Marina sent a postcard to Jim's parents. Her 1-cent postal card was augmented by 20 cents for the airmail fee for carriage by the Pan American Clipper. The postcard was censored by the Information Control Branch, known as the ICB. Marina returned to the U.S. and her family in Arkansas on Christmas Day. As the months passed, most of the crew of the West Virginia were reassigned to other ships. Jim remained as part of the salvage crew with duties as a gunner's mate and Naval Postal Clerk, although both duties were on a considerably smaller scale. Jim's familiarity with 16-inch gun turrets was put to use in the salvage of the West Virginia. Proficiency still had to be maintained for his return to sea duty. That involved study of new versions of heavy caliber guns and anti-aircraft guns being installed on ships. The West Virginia was refloated in June of 1942 and placed in dry dock until April of 1943, when she set sail for Bremerton, Washington for full restoration. She was returned to the fleet in June 1944. Naval personnel had developed all sorts of codes to get around censorship during the war. Jim used such code to let Marina know that he would be arriving at Bremerton aboard the West Virginia. His next assignment was the Naval Gun School at the Washington Navy Yard in D.C., where he was assigned to its gunnery classes. He never returned to the West Virginia. At the Naval Gun School, Jim was quickly promoted to chief instructor, but an unforeseen difficulty arose. Namely, the Navy's preeminent naval gunnery school found that it had an enlisted man serving as chief instructor. No problem. The Navy promoted Jim to the rank of US Navy ensign. Following World War II, he was promoted to lieutenant and assigned to various seagoing tankers, becoming the youngest sea captain in the Pacific Fleet by 1952. In February 1954, Downing was back in the Pacific as the commanding officer of the tanker USS Patapsco. The ship was ordered to take a load of fuel to Bikini Island. When the ship arrived, Jim was directed to Eniwetok, where he was ordered to leave the area immediately. His tanker had stumbled into the first test of the American H-bomb, known as the Castle Bravo tests. The ship was 200 miles away when the bomb detonated. Radioactive debris rained down around the world and on Jim's ship. The men of the Patapsco received huge amounts of radiation exposure during their return voyage to Pearl Harbor. Afterwards, the ship underwent 3 weeks of decontamination. A controversy still exists between the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission's official report of the test and Jim Downing's account as to why the ship was in the blast area. Responsibility for the test had been transferred to the AEC, with President Eisenhower issuing orders that no publicity was to be given on the tests. Consequently, the Patapsco was unaware that it should avoid the Castle Bravo test area. Despite a significant fleet presence, postal history of the time surrounding the test is scarce. The fleet tug USS Sioux was a member of that fleet assembled to support the Castle Bravo test. Air quality testing for radioactivity by the U.S. Army Airways Communications System was still being conducted 3 weeks later. Very early in his naval career, Jim Downing became a member of a Christian evangelical association focused on Bible study. Founded in 1933, they became officially known as the Navigators under the leadership of Dawson Trotman. They relied on word of mouth aboard the West Virginia to spread their message. Gradually, the Navigators grew in numbers from their original 6. Their message expanded to college campuses throughout the nation in the 1950s. In 1956, Jim retired from the U.S. Navy as a lieutenant and relocated to Colorado Springs. The Navigators had established their headquarters at Glen Erie and he became their vice president. The Navigators have since grown into a worldwide missionary movement. This brings us full circle in Jim Downing's personal and naval life. By war's end, Jim had emerged from the disaster at Pearl Harbor as a successful naval officer and embarked on his career as an evangelical missionary. At the same time, Fuchida was an embittered man. He had survived the war only to see Japan's surrender at Tokyo Bay, where our story began. He believed that Japanese POWs had been severely mistreated, a natural expectation given Japanese rules of behavior towards POWs. In 1947, when a repatriated Japanese POW caught up with him, much was to change. The POW had been Fuchida's radio man. The radio man had not been treated brutally by his American captors. He could not explain the difference in practices from the Japanese, but believed it had something to do with the Americans' religious practices in Christianity. This revelation stunned Fuchida, launching him on a lifelong quest to understand Christianity. This led to his conversion. He also sought out proponents of the faith, including Billy Graham, and those who had experienced warfare. His newfound Christian leanings led him to the Navigators and Jim Downing. In their first introduction, they both realized that on that Pacific Sunday morning, both had been following their duty to their nations. Through a mutual bond of faith solidified by wartime experiences, Downing had the distinct pleasure of becoming Fuchida's lifelong acquaintance. One of Jim's mementos of this acquaintance is a Christian missionary brochure written by Fuchida. Jim Downing's story can be found in such works as his book, The Other Side of Infamy, in the 2017 Military Postal History Society Bulletin, issues 3 and 4, and numerous websites on the internet. Jim Downing's Navy career began as an ordinary seaman, and he retired as an officer. He survived Pearl Harbor, rendering great service to his fellow crew. He was the youngest sea captain in the Pacific Fleet, and he was a Naval Postal Clerk.
Hello, I'm Sergio Lugo. Along with the other members of the production team, Richard Truly, Paul Albright, and Joe Lynott, I want to express our sincere thanks to James Downing, his family, and staff for allowing us to produce this video. It was an honor and a privilege to have had the opportunity to meet and talk with Jim. I am sorry to say that Jim passed away during the production of this video and was unable to see the final production. Our sincere condolences to his family and friends. Our thanks to retired Vice Admiral Richard Truly for hosting our story. Richard flew as a carrier fighter pilot and as an experimental test pilot. He piloted the space shuttles Enterprise and Columbia and commanded the Space Shuttle Challenger. He retired from the Navy on the frigate USS Constitution on the 4th of July, 1989. He directed NASA for 3.5 years, and he has collected stamps for over 70 years. In 2012, the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library began a series of philatelic videos designed and developed by volunteers on the many aspects of stamp collecting. Since that time, it has produced many videos that can be found on its website and on YouTube.